Gas bans cause war and the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials. And the Millennial joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer. Welcome to this podcast, which is called Gas Bans Cause War. So first up, before we go there, the S&P 500 podcast listeners, the stock market, but the bellwether S&P 500 enters correction territory as sell-off continues. If you hold any stocks, you will know, because you probably looked at your portfolio and seen that you are a lot poorer under the Biden administration, poorer from inflation, and now poorer because your stocks are falling. The S&P 500 in the Wall Street Journal entered correction territory on Monday as the 2022 swoon for major U.S. stock indexes accelerated. Favored speculative stock investments, including tech stocks and smaller companies, led the slump. The Russell 2000 index of small stocks is down nearly 20% from its 52-week high, while the tech-heavy NASDAQ composite is down 16% from its record 2 months ago. So in 2 months, it's already down 16%. Monday's market slide extended to cryptocurrencies, with Bitcoin at one point losing half of its market value since its November high. So Bitcoin, if you bought Bitcoin, it is now worth half of its value if you bought it in November. Investors are bracing for a Federal Reserve meeting this week in which the central bank is expected to shed more light on its plans to combat surging inflation. And of course, podcast listeners, how do you do that? Well, the Fed would have to raise interest rates. If it raises interest rates, more people are going to take their money out of the stock market. Then the stock market's going to fall even further. They're going to take their money out of the stock market because they're going to put it in the safety of bonds, right? Or CDs or what have you. Certainly, they're going to keep it liquid or more liquid than in the stock market, which now, when you look at it, you're like, well, that's not really liquidity because who knows? It could drop even more, and it's probably going to. The market has also been spooked by mounting tensions between the West and Russia over the military buildup on the border with the Ukraine, which we're going to talk about at great lengths during this podcast, which is why we're calling the podcast Gas Bans Cause War. The tech-focused NASDAQ composite lost 2.8%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was down 2.2%, or about 740 points, putting the blue chip index on the track for its seventh consecutive losing day. So the moral of the story, podcast listeners, is your money doesn't go as far as it used to in the United States because of inflation. Your money is losing and your stocks are losing value, which means you are less wealthy because the stock market is falling. And interest rates, while they are expected to be increased in terms of borrowing capacity, if you want to borrow, your borrowing cost will be increased. But I really doubt that the banks are going to go and say, oh, we're going to really rapidly increase the interest rate on your savings. Because if you notice, banks rarely do that. You know, they don't do it as fast as they absolutely could when the Fed increases interest rates for borrowing. So then you ask yourself the question, well, where the heck do I put my money? Which is why so many people are buying real estate. So the last part of this economy, the last shoe to drop of this economy, if it does, is real estate. If real estate drops in value significantly, like if you have a real estate recession or a recession that also affects real estate, then every part of the economy is going to be in trouble. This is what it's like to live in a Democrat dystopia. And so, podcast listeners, that is why we're calling this podcast Gas Bans Cause War. Because cancel culture and natural gas have met one another in a big way. In the Hill magazine, for example, just recently, the U.S. not considering gas export ban, officials say. So what does that mean? Well, it means the Democrats have been working for years to ban gas in the United States of America. New York City, for example, has banned the use of natural gas in all new construction in New York City, as well as any renovated building. So if you want to go to renovate your building, That's considered new construction. You can no longer use natural gas for cooking. You can no longer use natural gas for heating. And the Democrats are doing this across the country. And the fear was that the White House, which has canceled various natural gas projects across the United States, also may want to cancel natural gas exports from the United States. This is actually something I know a little bit about because in the county in which I live, which is the beautiful county of Calvert County, Maryland, we have a Dominion natural gas liquefaction export plant. So what is that? It's a plant where there are pipes that go underground to the plant from the natural gas fields of Pennsylvania and West Virginia and elsewhere. And that natural gas, when it is extracted, is piped to this facility, among other places. And this facility on the Chesapeake Bay in Calvert County, Maryland, is liquefied and then loaded onto these massive ships and then sent overseas where countries that need the natural gas don't have any kind of meaningful natural resources for heating and for energy sources for their economies. So those ships actually find their way, among other places, to Japan. And there were enormous conversations about these same ships from the county in which I live to export this natural gas to Western Europe en masse, right? To build a new natural gas liquefaction receiving plant in Europe so that Europe could use that natural gas. Any country in Western Europe or Eastern Europe could use that natural gas that wanted to buy it, to the extent that they actually had a pipeline that could use it. And this matters. This matters because now we have a situation in the European theater where we have Russia just about ready to invade the Ukraine, and we have Germany that is silent on the issue because Germany is dependent upon Russia for what? Natural gas. Natural gas. And so in 2005 or thereabouts, there were many discussions with Germany as to how do you plan on actually powering your economy, because you want to completely power your economy with green energy. And the Germans said, yeah, that's exactly what we're going to do. And we're not going to build any nuclear. We're not going to build any nuclear power plants to power our economy. It's just going to be green energy. No more carbon fuels whatsoever. None, 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 none. And so fast forward, Germany has found out two things. One, they can't power their economy through solar and wind. They just can't. Two, they should have built the nuclear power plants when they had the time. And of course, combined with that, they've decided to buy natural gas from Russia, which they are dependent upon. Meanwhile, the leadership in the White House won't allow or is trying to discourage natural gas exports from the United States to where? To the rest of the world. So in the Hill magazine, they found it necessary to write an article that says the U.S. is not considering gas export ban. Well, of course they're considering an export. They're trying to ban natural gas usage in the United States of America. Why would they allow us to export natural gas to the rest of the world if they don't want us to use it in our own country? But they found it necessary to print this article because of the fact that you now have the potential of war. You now have the potential of war in Europe because Russia, naturally, which is a gas can with a large military, has the ability and the will to invade the Ukraine. So the U.S. is not considering a ban on exporting liquefied natural gas to other countries, a Biden official said Wednesday, despite a push from some Democrats to curb exports of the fuel. Asked during a House Energy and Commerce Committee hearing whether an export ban was on the table, Deputy Energy Secretary David Turk said, an export ban, either on the LNG side or the oil side, is not something we're currently discussing and under consideration. His comments comes after administration officials have said they're not planning to ban exports on crude oil, a solution that has been pushed by several Democrats to tamp down on gasoline prices since gasoline is made from oil. No, ladies and gentlemen, that's not why the Democrats are trying to stop that. The Democrats want to stop all carbon fuels. They want us to stop the use of the fuels in the United States, and they want the rest of the world to not use them as well. Or at least they don't want the rest of the world to use the fuels that would be coming from the United States. So this Hill article is a complete joke. It is basically CYA now of the White House and of the Democrats as to why they're finally saying, oh, well, we know inflation is really out of control and gas prices are really high, but we're going to allow the United States to still export natural gas. We're going to allow it. But some have also said they want to limit or stop exports of natural gas. Representatives Nanette Barragan, Democrat of California, and Jan Schakowsky, Democrat of Illinois, last month introduced legislation that would ban both crude oil and natural gas exports, though the legislation is unlikely to be taken up. During the same hearing, when asked about banning LNG exports, Turk gave a general answer. We're looking at the full range of what you all are giving us to look at, he said. But when asked about this, the Energy Department pointed the Hill to Turk's remarks stating that such a ban is currently not under consideration. Sure. So, podcast listeners, why does this matter? Why does this matter? Because when you are energy dependent as a country, you are vulnerable. You are a vulnerable country when you are energy dependent. And the Biden administration is making the United States less energy independent and more energy dependent. The Biden administration is not recognizing the fact that in Europe, war is actually likely as a result of the dependence of certain countries in Western Europe, like Germany, on Russian natural gas, rather than being smart about it. If Germany were smart about it, they would have a liquefaction natural gas plant in Europe that would receive exports from the United States or elsewhere in the world, and they'd have two options to power their economy. They could bring in natural gas from Russia, and they could bring in natural gas from the United States, as an example. But instead, they are completely and utterly dependent, and that's exactly what Vladimir Putin has wanted for years. And we're not even going to talk about yet, at least, about the whole idea of Russian collusion, right? The whole 4 years of Russian collusion, and now we have a president of the United States that looks like he's colluding, especially with how compromised his son is with the Ukraine. We'll talk about that in a minute. So in the Daily Caller, NATO deploys fighter jets, aircraft carriers to Eastern Europe as the threat of a Russian invasion grows. I mean, it looks pretty imminent to me when you look at the satellite photos, and I'm not a military expert, but when you look at the satellite photos and any reasonable person sees what appears to be, many hundreds, if not 1,000 tanks and other kinds of military gear and armored gear, and you look at it, it's all around the border of the Ukraine. Why else would you do it? Why else would you do it? So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, said Monday that it was deploying fighter jets and aircraft carriers to Eastern Europe as Russia prepares to launch a military invasion into the Ukraine. Additional ships and fighter jets to NATO deployments in Eastern Europe, reinforcing Allied deterrence and defense as Russia continues its military buildup in and around Ukraine, the alliance said in a statement. Specifics surrounding how many ships and jets will be sent remained unclear. The announcement came a day after President Joe Biden reportedly began considering whether to send thousands of U.S. troops to the region in an attempt to deter Russia as tensions between the two superpowers continue to rise. The United States has also made clear that it is considering increasing its military presence in the eastern part of the alliance, NATO said, which I can assure you, podcast listeners, is not going to make Vladimir Putin very happy because that is his biggest fear. The statement outlined how NATO members plan to join the Allied military front. Denmark is deploying a frigate to the Baltic Sea and 4 fighter jets to Lithuania. Spain is dispatching ships and jets in the same manner, and France has said that it may send troops to Romania. Quote, NATO will continue to take all necessary measures to protect and defend all of our allies, including by reinforcing the eastern part of the alliance, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said. We will always respond to any deterioration of our security environment, including through strengthening our collective defense. The Allied forces will counter over 100,000 Russian troops. Think about that, podcast listeners. 100,000 Russian troops stationed near the Ukrainian border. And while Russia seems poised to invade the former member of the USSR, having already invaded Crimea in 2014, the Kremlin has denied that it plans to invade this sovereign nation. Oh, yeah, sure. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov have said the West was engaged in hysteria and spouting information laced with lies. I mean, you gotta love the Russians, you know? Yeah, well, I'm not sure why you guys are so upset. I mean, there are only 100,000 troops that are amassed at the border of the Ukraine. There's nothing to worry about whatsoever. You're just overreacting. The West is overreacting. So also in the Daily Wire, this is all interconnected, and it's building towards the thesis here on Mark and the Millennials. Biden administration warns it will not be in a position to evacuate U.S. citizens from the Ukraine. Sounds a little bit like Afghanistan, doesn't it? I mean, so Democrat President Joe Biden's administration has reportedly indicated that it will not be able to evacuate U.S. citizens from the Ukraine amid rapidly deteriorating conditions as Russia appears likely to invade at any moment. Quote, given that the president has said military action by Russia could come at any time, the U.S. government will not be in a position to evacuate U.S. citizens, Biden's State Department said, according to Fox News correspondent Jennifer Griffin. Quote, so U.S. citizens currently present in the Ukraine should plan accordingly. But what are you supposed to plan? I mean, if you live in the Ukraine and you are a United States citizen and you're there for work or business, I mean, it stands to reason that you're pretty much on your own as far as the Biden administration is concerned. And isn't that a conversation that Biden should be having with Vladimir Putin? So the news came as the Biden administration ordered the families of all American personnel at the U.S. Embassy in the Ukraine on Sunday to immediately leave the country. Well, that seems to me like war is imminent then, right? War is imminent when you say to your State Department consulate in the country that looks like it's going to be invaded, yeah, it's time to leave. The security conditions, particularly along Ukraine's borders in Russia, occupied Crimea, and in Russia-controlled eastern Ukraine, are unpredictable and can deteriorate with little notice. Demonstrations, which have turned violent at times, regularly occur throughout Ukraine, including in Kiev, the department said. Do not travel to Ukraine due to the increased threats of Russian military action and COVID-19. Yes, right. You shouldn't travel to the Ukraine because of COVID-19. No, you shouldn't travel to the Ukraine because there are 100,000 Russian troops at the border. Exercise increased caution in the Ukraine due to crime and civil unrest. Some areas have increased risk. That was from the State Department. A separate report on Sunday indicated that Biden was considering deploying U.S. forces to Eastern Europe in an apparent attempt to not appear weak, although many experts warn that it's a little too late for that. So, podcast listeners, you have a situation where you have a weak economy, U.S. economy. You have a weak United States president. You have a Democrat-controlled House and Senate, and the White House obviously has Joe Biden in it. Democrats are in control of all aspects of the federal government, and they have done everything they can to shut down the United States energy industry. And as a result, the United States has record gasoline and oil prices because the Biden administration and the Democrat Congress have shut down pipelines, have discouraged investment in these kinds of energies. And the United States is no longer an energy net exporter. Instead, we now need to import this energy. It is the dumbest combination of policies I've ever seen in my life. And now you have the Russians realizing this. It's not very hard. They're clearly cooperating with and conspiring with China because China is watching very closely to see how successful Putin is and what price he will actually pay, what price his military pays, what price his economy pays, because Chinese they kind of want to do the same thing, but they want to do it with Taiwan. And this is all happening when you have a guy who is having early stages of Alzheimer's in the White House. And you have to say to yourself, at what point will the American people realize that cancel culture, which has tried to ban natural gas and ban all kinds of energy, is not directly, if not indirectly, responsible for what looks like is going to be a war. A war certainly between the Ukraine and Russia. But how do we, the American people, stay out of this? How? And so in the Wall Street Journal, there is a reasonably good article titled "How Events in the United States, Germany, and China Embolden Putin." So the U.S. reluctance to engage militarily, Germany's energy dependence on Moscow, and China's growing friendship with Russia appear to encourage the Kremlin to invade the Ukraine. So trying to read the mind of Russian President Vladimir Putin is a risky business anytime. And it is also the same concerning this mounting crisis over the Ukraine. Yet in trying to figure out why Putin is laying the groundwork for a move on the Ukraine and doing so now, a few crucial factors emerge from the fog. He wants to move now because he sees Ukraine slipping from his grasp. And the reasons he may think he's free to act actually lie in three other countries: the US, Germany, and China. In this combination of forces, in fact, helping drive Mr. Putin, they also demonstrate why dissuading him is proving difficult. He may feel both a sense of urgency and a fleeting moment of opportunity. The motivation starts with the Ukraine itself. It's moving towards the West, no doubt about it, in no small measure because Mr. Putin's own thuggish behavior, his invasion of Crimea, threats, and bullying all have produced the opposite of what Putin intended. He now feels a need to reverse the anti-Russian, pro-Western sentiment that he fostered if Ukraine is to end up where Mr. Putin thinks it belongs, which is, of course, in Russia's orbit. He sees this inexorable strengthening of ties between the West and the Ukraine, says Robert Gates, the former defense secretary and head of the Central Intelligence Agency and a longtime Russia analyst. The US and other Europeans are providing weapons and training. They may not be members of NATO, the Ukraine, but that security relationship is getting stronger by the day. From his point of view, there is some urgency to act on the Ukraine before developments there become irreversible. So that's the reason Putin wants to act. But why should Mr. Putin think he can get away with attacking the sovereignty of a neighbor? Start with how he likens and sees the US and Americans and how they are deeply divided among themselves, with some questioning the validity of very elections that form the core of democracy. That suggests that the power of the US to act decisively is diminishing by internal squabbling, and that the power of its Democrat model is similarly diminished. Meanwhile, 3 straight American presidents, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and now Joe Biden have demonstrated through word and deed that Americans are tired of engagements abroad, particularly military engagements. The prospect that the U.S. might mount a military response to a Russian invasion of Ukraine is dim and must have been made even more dim in Mr. Putin's mind by the ugly withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan last year. It's hard to avoid the thought that Biden's Afghanistan fiasco suggested to Putin that this is a guy who can be pushed around, says Stephen Sechanovich, a Russian expert and a former national security official who now teaches at Columbia University. Mr. Putin may be wrong about that, but it's easy to see how he might draw that conclusion. And here's the important part, podcast listeners. At the same time, Germany is giving Mr. Putin reason to doubt that the West can really unite in response to a Russian invasion. Germany's decision to close all of its nuclear reactors by the end of 2022 has made it more dependent than ever on Russian energy imports, meaning Mr. Putin's leverage over Berlin is at its peak. German officials are talking about standing with the Ukraine, but their actions strike a different tone. While tiny little Estonia, with a population of just over 1 million people, compared with 83 million people in Germany and 144 million people in Russia, the Estonians want to send weapons to the Ukraine in a show of solidarity. Germany refused to issue permits for the export of German-made weapons, meaning that Germany wouldn't help. Meantime, Mr. Putin's warming relationship with China gives him reason to think Beijing will be there to help him overcome whatever Western economic sanctions are put in place after an incursion into the Ukraine. Mr. Putin and Chinese leader Xi Jinping have made a show of their friendship in recent months, and Mr. Putin will be a high-profile guest at the coming Beijing Winter Olympics. I sure hope they don't give him any anal swabs while he's there. So, podcast listeners, here's the thing. You have the Biden administration in this incredible pickle in that we have an open southern border in the United States. And the Biden administration is saying borders don't matter. And meanwhile, in the Ukraine, the Biden administration is saying borders matter. We have a Biden administration saying natural gas doesn't matter and should be canceled. And meanwhile, we have the Biden administration saying, yes, but we can continue to export natural gas. That's okay. We just don't want to use it in the United States. We have a Biden administration that has a child, Hunter Biden, who made millions of dollars in the Ukraine. And we suddenly have this interest in potentially supporting the Ukraine. And you have to ask yourself as an American, is the Ukraine, is it really an important place? Is it important to America's security? Is it important to Europe's security? And this is the question that Americans must ask. I also have to ask this question as well, podcast listeners. And I have to throw this out there, okay? I'm not saying this is so, but I have to throw this out there just to get people thinking about this. To what extent is this conflict helpful in getting the American people to not focus on what's really happening in their lives and in their own country? Inflation, right? Inflation of energy, inflation of food, inflation of housing, a stock market that's dropping, interest rates that are about to go up, supply chain issues, clearly when you go into your grocery store and you have empty shelves, and you're focused on your day-to-day living in America, and then suddenly there's this crisis that occurs in the Ukraine. And you say to yourself, well, okay, fine. The Russians have amassed all of these tanks at the border, and they've amassed 100,000 troops at the border. And so a normal person understandably would say, well, it clearly is the Russians who are the aggressor. But I have to throw this out there to you podcast listeners. To what extent are our intelligence agencies in the Ukraine stirring things up? To what extent are intelligence agencies in the United States providing and have been providing, let's say, for many months, potentially, let's say 6, 8, 9, 10 months or a year, providing substantial military assistance to the Ukraine long before Russia brought tanks and personnel to the border? To what extent has America been involved in the Ukraine and trying to give the Ukrainians lots of military advice and training and other kinds of support that threaten, whether correctly or not, Vladimir Putin? And so any reasonable person has to ask themselves this question, because our military industrial complex in the United States is so enormous and our intelligence agencies are so powerful and so enormous. To what extent is this being stirred up first by us? I don't know, okay? My gut is it's much more likely that Vladimir Putin is being the traditional Russian bully, which is what the Russians, the Russian leadership traditionally has been throughout history, and that he decided that he is very concerned about the Ukraine moving closer to the West, and I think that makes perfect sense. However, since the newspapers are reporting that that is so, then to what extent have our intelligence agencies been providing the Ukrainians military personnel long before this military buildup by Russia, and Russia's decided to engage? I think these are good questions, because one of the classic things that is dangerous in a democracy is when you have a president that is in enormous political trouble and his party is in enormous political trouble, and then he suddenly has a war overseas, or a potential war or a potential conflict, to get the American people to forget about what's really happening back home. And this is really worth considering. This is really worth, I'm not saying it is so, but let's say something that is so. The Biden administration talking about the Ukraine during press conferences gets the pressure off of him to have to talk about anything else, like the economy, as I said already. And I think this is important stuff, because in this podcast, we started out saying natural gas bans cause war. And as you know, in the Mark and the Millennials podcast, I'm very much against banning not just natural gas, but this whole idea of the Democrat Party. They don't like something that's like banning climate change. We're going to ban this. We're going to ban that. There's nothing that you can't ban once you decide to use that moniker of climate change. And as a result, these individuals in the Democrat Party have put the United States economy at great risk. And now they've put the United States of America at the risk of going to war, because they have their policies have weakened Europe. Germany's policies have weakened Germany, no doubt about it. And the Democrats' policies and the left's policies have weakened the United States of America. And they've done it in such a short amount of time. It's truly unbelievable. And so this is worth watching. It's also, please, podcast listeners, please continue to ask that critical question. And that question is, to what extent did the United States of America, through its intelligence agencies in the Ukraine, quietly and secretly provoke the Russians? To what extent did that happen? It's worth asking the question. And so next up, podcast listeners, Jen Psaki works for Barack Obama. So you know how on this podcast I have said from the very beginning of the Biden administration, from the very beginning, when he first assumed office 1 year ago, I said he's not in charge. This is Barack Obama's third term. Repeatedly, I've said that. And I've said it because good old Joe Biden never seems like he's very much in control. And I'm pretty sure that when you don't see him, he's probably taking long naps. Or if he's not taking long naps, he's sitting in his chair dreaming about or thinking about taking naps, because he's just not that present. And as you know, podcast listeners, remember when the aides of Joe Biden built a fake White House? So that way he really never had to go to the White House. I mean, even though he's supposed to be living there, there's a fake White House, which I think was built in the old executive office building right next to it. which is kind of weird. And it makes you wonder. And I thought back then, well, maybe it's like right next to a bedroom, right? Maybe he can go in the bedroom and sleep for a couple hours, and then they wake him up and he goes into the fake White House and does these fake news conferences and fake conversations. Well, the point of all this, and the point that I've been making really for the past year since Biden took office, is Barack Obama is in charge. Well, Jen Psaki goes on The View. She goes on The View, and they interview her, and they're like, oh my God, Jen, are you truly thinking about leaving the White House? Oh my God, it'd be terrible if you have to leave. And so then Jen makes a big slip and talks about who her boss really is. We have that clip, podcast listeners, and here it is.
Jen, before I get rid of you, which I'm enjoying you so much today, I really am.
I'm enjoying you too.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
But a little bird told me that you said you might be resigning the job this year. Say it isn't so. Is it true?
I don't know when I'm leaving. This is an honor and a privilege, and I love working for President Biden every single day. I love spending time with him, hearing what's on his mind. Actually, going on the road with him is really the best thing possible. I wish everybody could have that experience because he gets so much joy out of it. No one likes a rope line more than President Biden.
So there's Jen Psaki saying, I love working for President Biden. And so I'm pretty sure it's obvious at this point who Jen Psaki works for. It's the Obama administration. Barack Obama is still in charge. His people surround Biden. His people are running the country because Biden is in bed. He's really not there. He's not present. But Jen Psaki goes on The View and she says it better than anybody else. No, by the way, podcast listeners, Joy Behar on The View. I mean, is that the most annoying voice ever? It's like, hey, Jen Psaki, what do you think about that? I mean, I cannot imagine being married to a voice like that. Right? I'm just sorry. It would drive me crazy. I mean, my best title for her would be X, right? That's my ex. Believe me, best decision I ever made. So, way to go, Jen Psaki, for telling us something that we all already knew, namely that you work for Barack Obama. So next up, podcast listeners, good old former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, slams Liz Cheney for saying January 6th panel members could be jailed. Gingrich said that. He said that the January 6th panel members could be jailed for their behavior. So I actually saw this interview. I think it was on Fox News. However, New York Post is reporting that Representative Liz Cheney, one of two GOP lawmakers on the House Select Committee, Adam Kinzinger is the other one, investigating last year's Capitol riot, slammed former House Speaker Newt Gingrich after he suggested that members of the panel could face legal consequences if Republicans can take control of Congress in November of this year. Quote, I think when you have a Republican Congress, this is all going to come crashing down, said Gingrich. Well, we have that clip. It's worth listening to. Here it is.
You're going to have a Republican majority in the House and a Republican majority in the Senate. And all these people who've been so tough and so mean and so nasty are going to be delivered subpoenas for every document, every conversation, every tweet, every email, because I think it's clear that these are people who are literally just running over the law, pursuing innocent people, causing them to spend thousands and thousands of dollars in legal fees for no justification. And it's basically a lynch mob. And unfortunately, the Attorney General of the United States has joined that lynch mob and is totally misusing the FBI. And I think when you have a Republican Congress, this is all going to come crashing down. And the wolves are going to find out that they're now sheep. And they're the ones who are, in fact, going to, I think, face a real risk of jail for the kind of laws they're breaking.
Yeah, so Gingrich is referring to the committees, the January 6th committee's continuous attempt to look into personal emails of individuals, but not engaging in transparency. So what does that mean? It means that you have people who are jailed, obviously, and I haven't seen a single interview on the media of any of the individuals who are jailed. I'm sorry. Why hasn't there been an interview by the mainstream media or by any media outlet whatsoever? of any of the individuals who are being jailed for the so-called January 6th riot, or as the Democrats call the insurrection. And I think this is important. How about the involvement of that one gentleman from the FBI? We've seen it on Tucker Carlson again and again, and Tucker keeps calling this guy out, who basically was inviting people to go inside of the Capitol. And were there other people involved? That's what I mean by transparency. And I think this is what Gingrich is talking about in part, because he's saying that they are way overstepping their given duties, this January 6th committee, namely that instead of just trying to find out what happened, did anyone in the administration order this to happen? Look, I think that's, podcast listeners, you may or may not disagree with me, but here's what I think. If someone ordered this to happen, namely like someone, I don't know how you could order a riot, by the way. I don't know how you could order someone to go inside and break inside of a building. I don't know how that's possible. But if someone was in a position of responsibility and they did that, okay, I think that's worth looking into for sure. But here's the problem. It appears to critical thinking people in America right now that the only person or persons responsible for ordering people to break into the Capitol were either those individuals who were inside and got inside and broke inside, or maybe potentially this one guy who was an FBI informant or works for the FBI or other members of the FBI. I don't know. But Donald Trump and Newt Gingrich, one thing's for sure. When the Republicans get back in control, I'm hoping that there really is a thorough and fair investigation of what actually happened. And I hope we really get to the bottom of if there really were any government agents involved in this. And at the same time, we really need to have the media go and interview these individuals. So I know a few of these individuals have already been incarcerated. That is to say, they've had trials or they have agreed to plea and they're serving their sentences. These individuals need to be interviewed. And they need to be interviewed, and those interviews need to be aired. I don't understand why there is so much silence on this. It's really strange. And I think this is probably why Carlson is talking about this more than most, because I think any reasonable American who would look at this January 6th panel that's doing these investigations, and you look at this group of individuals, and all you hear is this one side, and you don't hear from the individuals who are being incarcerated at the moment without trial, some of them, it sure makes you wonder where you live. And I have to say that until that is addressed, you're going to have more people come up with conspiracies, right? What are they afraid of? Why aren't there more people who are willing in the media, who are willing to go talk to these individuals who are incarcerated to ask them questions? Simple questions like, hey, did anyone order you? Did anyone order you to actually go do this? Did they? Did anyone tell you from the administration that you should move forward and that you should absolutely positively break into the United States Congress in the Capitol and that you should try to take over the government? Did anyone convince you that that is the case? Now, of course, reasonable people may say, well, they can't ask those questions because they're already incarcerated and they're waiting for a trial and they don't want to tell anyone about this story. Well, how about the people that have cop pleas? Why can't we hear from them? Why is all this? Why aren't there more conversations about this? This is what really bothers me, podcast listeners, and it's worth it for all of us to talk about this in great detail, in my personal opinion. So next up, podcast listeners, we did cover this story briefly a few months ago, but now that the Olympics are just around the corner and that they're being held in China, China is bringing back the COVID anal swab for the Winter Olympics. Can't make this stuff up. So the Chinese government also gave the Biden administration officials anal swab COVID tests upon arriving in China in error. China supposedly stopped this invasive swab testing, needless to say, after Japan, the US, and other countries said the virus was undignified, the test was undignified, and caused psychological distress. So again, China stopped this invasive swabbing once the United States and Japan and other countries said that such testing was undignified and caused psychological distress. But now it's back, just in time for the Beijing Winter Olympics. And so you have to ask yourself the question, why is this happening? Okay? Why is this happening? Why is it that China finds it necessary to provide or to require such a test? I don't know what the answer is, podcast listeners, but certainly one thing is for sure. China is a country that doesn't really care much about human rights. And so if you come into their country and you're being asked to take this kind of test, you certainly should ask yourself the question, is there any other way that you can take this test, this COVID test? And why is it necessary anyway if you've been vaccinated? Because I thought that in order to be in the Olympics, you had to prove vaccination status. But I digress. So next up, podcast listeners, we have the dumbest bill in America. And do we have a lead up, Mr. Producer? Here it is. And it's the dumbest bill in America, and it is voter registration drives in high schools. Voter registration drives in high schools. This bill, put forward by State Delegate Ariana Kelly of Maryland, is a bill that requires, get this, podcast listeners, it requires that voter registration drives are administered by local boards of elections inside of high schools and may include an event on school property. This is right from the bill, okay? House Bill 201, voter registration drives in high schools, where registration applications can be approved by the state board right on the campus of the high school. And they may include any event on the school property during school hours open to each employee of any student enrolled in the school. So employee of the school or a student of the school who is or will be 16 years old, but you can't vote until you're 18. Yeah, so we'll get to that in a minute. Local school board officials, employees, or authorized volunteers visiting classrooms within a school can also push for voter registration drives, podcast listeners. But before we read the rest of this bill of voter registration drives in high schools, let's talk about the state delegate who put it in. The state delegate, Ariana Kelly of Maryland, has put this bill in before. And we're going to talk about what it actually does and what it means in a minute. But first up, let's tell you a little bit about Ariana Kelly. We have a clip on this from Channel 2 in DC from 2015. So Channel 2 is a station in Washington, DC from 2015. And Ariana Kelly was featured. Here's the sponsor. We have that clip, and here it is.
State lawmaker is in trouble tonight, accused of indecent exposure and trespassing. Delegate Ariana Kelly was dropping her children off at her ex-husband's house in Bethesda. Now, charging documents say she was upset that his fiancée was inside the home. Barack Sanford told police that Kelly started ringing the doorbell and banging on the door, and he asked that she leave. Sanford played a cell phone video for police that showed Kelly ringing the doorbell numerous times and exposing her breast. Trial is set for August 13th. Now, earlier this year, Kelly was said to be considering a run for the 8th congressional district seat being vacated by Representative Chris Van Hollen.
Somehow that delegate, podcast listeners, after showing her breasts and then being charged with this indecent exposure thing, she wants to go inside of high schools now. She wants there to be voter registration drives in high schools. This individual And I guess her pronouns are she, her, since she showed her breasts, but who knows anymore from Montgomery County? It could be anyone, I'm not quite sure. But let's read from this bill, voter registration drives in high schools. Local school board officials or local election board officials, employees or authorized volunteers can visit the classrooms within a school during school hours, distributing voter registration applications to the employees of the school and to any student who will be 16 years or older. At least once each school year, this can happen. Each local board shall conduct a voter registration drive in each public high school in the county in a manner specified in an agreement between the local school board and the local board of education and the, of course, election board. Each public official responsible for the use of a public high school shall make available to the local board without charge the space that's needed so they can have a voter registration drive. So podcast listeners, this allows individuals who will be 16, so actually as young as 15, but it says 16, but when you read the fine print, they could actually be as young as 15, to register in high schools and for there to be voter registration drives in high schools. Why does this matter? Because these are the individuals in the Democrat Party who want people as young as 16 to vote in elections. They want people as young as 16 to vote in county elections, state elections, and federal elections. That is really what they want. And they want that because they believe that those voter registration drives will skew more in the Democrats' favor. The younger people are indoctrinated, especially in these public schools that this individual wants to go into. And so State Delegate Ariana Kelly put this voter registration drive in high schools because, you don't have very much to do in high school, like learn math and learn science and learn English. Oh no, what you really need to do is you need to get really involved in civic opportunities like learning how to vote at the age of 16 when you can't vote anyway. And so increasingly, we see these individuals in state legislatures trying to turn children into adults. You're an adult at 18 in America. That's when you get to vote. You're not an adult at 16. You're still a child. So stay the heck out of the public high schools. Stay out of all the high schools. But that is why the Democrat Party wants to get so involved in high schools, because first, they can write the curriculum that indoctrinates the students into being woke and far left. And then they have voter registration drives that are compulsory in the high school, and that even volunteer organizations, right? A volunteer organization, in theory, could even go in there, and who knows who the voluntary organization is, but they're authorized to go inside of the public high school, these volunteer organizations, and do what? Register people. So who are these volunteer organizations? Do you want a volunteer organization who could be from any kind of political persuasion going inside and talking to your children about how they should register to vote and even having that conversation? How about the average 16-year-old when they go up to the voter registration drive table and say, well, I don't really know what I am. I don't know if I'm a Democrat. I don't know if I'm a Republican. And then you have the person at the voter registration drive who's a, quote, volunteer say, well, why don't you just register as a Democrat to be safe? Why don't you just do that? And this is exactly what the Democrats have been dreaming forever, because they think children should be on school boards and should vote for budgets and union contracts, which is absurd. And they think children should also be able to vote and vote for incredibly very adult issues. And they are wrong. And these are the same people that are sexualizing our high schools and our middle schools and our elementary schools by putting this crazy agenda inside of them, these transgender agendas, I like that, inside the schools, and confusing children about pronouns and what they are. And cisgender, I just saw this the other day, Chris, cisgender. What is cisgender again?
I think we're cisgender.
Yeah, cisgender means that what? You go by the gender that you were assigned at birth. Is that a cisgender?
I think so.
Right. We call that a boy or a girl in the real world, but they call it a cisgender. And this is what they're doing in the public schools. And so now they want to have voter registration drives, and you know exactly what they're up to, podcast listeners. Not to mention the fact that this particular delegate is the same individual that has kind of issues with this matter herself. We played the clip for you. We're going to play it one more time because here is the sponsor. Here's what the sponsor did. Here it is.
State lawmaker is in trouble tonight, accused of indecent exposure and trespassing. Delegate Ariana Kelly was dropping her children off at her ex-husband's house in Bethesda. Now, charging documents say she was upset that his fiancee was inside the home. Barack Sanford told police that Kelly started ringing the doorbell and banging on the door, and he asked that she leave. Sanford played a cell phone video for police that showed Kelly ringing the doorbell numerous times and exposing her breast. Trial is set for August 13th. Now, earlier this year, Kelly was said to be considering a run for the 8th congressional district seat being vacated by Representative Chris Van Hollen.
And now that same delegate wants to have voter registration drives in high schools. And that's the dumbest bill in America. And that's it for Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.